Hey, what's up everybody? Today we are back with the final installment of me reacting to a series of videos on TikTok by this user Kendra Hilty, who is saying that she fell in love with her psychiatrist and details the story of that. Now I say it's the last installation. I don't think there's any chance we get through the rest of the videos today. I don't want the rest of my channel's life to be dedicated to reacting to her videos. So as far as we get today is as far as we're gonna get. I know a lot of you have commented that I'm giving her too much benefit of the doubt and unfairly maligning the psychiatrist. Towards the end of the second video that I did in this series, we were seeing some of the cracks start to show, where some of the inconsistencies or maybe some of the things that she is reading too much into certain things are starting to pick up a little bit. Again, I am watching this for the first time on camera, and so I don't have the background information. I don't have the benefit of seeing what her latest videos are like as a barometer for what her motive is for detailing the story and where inconsistencies may or may not be. So we're just going along on this journey together. Again, like I said, as far as we get today is as far as we're gonna get. We're starting from number 11 in her series, and I don't think that's even halfway through all of her numbered videos. So please do like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and let's dive into it.
October 2024, I make my first in-person appointment with my psychiatrist in November. My 75-year-old female therapist tells me that it's because he kept me on Zoom because he was so attracted to me. He didn't want to risk being in person with me, which further fed my crush.
That's a really weird thing for a therapist to say. I'm assuming that this therapist didn't have any contact with the psychiatrist, so for her to just read into he's really attracted to you and that's why he's keeping you on Zoom does seem like a bit of a stretch. But of course, at this point in her narrative, she's taking that as further evidence the psychiatrist is in love with her and is breaking ethical boundaries and crossing lines, doing things in an inappropriate manner because of this particular attraction that she claims that he has.
Or as some of you like to say, my delusion. So then my therapist starts texting me in between our weekly meetings, asking me for advice on her other clients. And I was a new coach. I had only been coaching for about a year, and I had just left my full-time job to be a coach full-time.
Okay, so I'm starting to see where I think people had mentioned in the first video that she has a coaching business, either on the side or it looks like full-time now, and that she is using this as a way for people to get into her socials so that she can sell her program or her services, whatever it might be. Whatever the reason for her relaying this, if the therapist was texting her in between sessions to ask for advice on what to do with clients, that's definitely a problematic issue. First of all, there could be confidentiality issues where if the therapist is relaying personal details about some of these people, that could compromise their confidentiality. Second is that you're consulting with your client now about other clients. And while I might consult with a coach or I might consult with another professional, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The difference is that now I'm mixing up the relationships. It's no longer a counselor-client relationship, it's collaborators, it's consultants. And what that means is that it shifts the dynamics, it muddies the water in their counselor-client interactions. Am I interacting with you as a peer and we're talking about problem solving another client together, or are we working to focus on you? And so if the therapist did this, introducing this kind of dynamic is really unhelpful for their process together.
And I was flattered that she would ask me advice on her other clients. I just thought, oh my gosh, a 75-year-old woman with a PhD wants my advice on what she should do with her clients. So then November rolls around, and
just a really quick note, she does seem to interpret things in a very, I guess, kind of self-flattering manner, which is fine in the sense that if you want to interpret things as just like, yeah, this person respects my opinion, sure, I can see that being a perfectly fine way to go through life. But then you're talking about, you take this lens and go back and think about the interactions, or what some people have labeled non-interactions with her psychiatrist, and all of those seem to shift towards some kind of self-flattering, they're so into me kind of mindset. Yeah, that could definitely lead to what she says a lot of her commenters are calling delusions. Again, this is the first bit that I'm seeing about that, and so I'm just developing that opinion and that possibility as maybe there's something going on there.
I'm about to meet my psychiatrist in person for the first time. So I wear a really pretty dress, I do my makeup, of course, right? And I show up and I get to talk to the office manager. We're having fun. And then my psychiatrist comes into the foyer and I am just so excited to finally meet him. I'd been his patient for 3 years at this point, and he had been feeding the dynamic for 3 years. And I was just thrilled to meet him. And I ran up and I gave him the biggest hug. And you know what he did? He barely patted me on the back. It was the most awkward thing ever.
I would get that if my client did that to me, regardless of whether I've been seeing them in person or not. Like, I'm already kind of cagey about physical contact with my clients. I try not to cross that boundary ever if I can help it. There are some clients who will ask if they can give me a hug. And interestingly enough, it's mostly been guys at the end of our work together. But again, that physical affection is definitely something that we as professionals need to think through, and being very careful about that. If I were the psychiatrist and this client, or this patient, I guess, was already showing a lot of this attraction towards me, I'm being put in a very tough spot where it seemed very spontaneous. It doesn't sound like she asked if she could hug him and she just ran up and hugged him. And so I don't think he could have been prepared for that necessarily. But then the reason that I try not to introduce any physical contact into my sessions or with my relationship with clients is because it can muddy the waters. The body language can be fairly subjective. And so I try to make sure that we talk about why is this happening, why we would choose to introduce physical contact if we ever do. Again, that's something I'm very wary about, and I don't think he had the chance to lay any groundwork for that, and he was just kind of blindsided by it. I'm curious to see what he did with that.
But I am so glad that he did that. I am really glad, because this is what I mean. My psychiatrist was many things, but he was not stupid. So I didn't ever touch him again. And I'm grateful that our relationship didn't ever cross that line, because it would have made everything so much harder. Anyway.
Yeah, it definitely would have been. She's recognizing that he was recognizing that that was a boundary crossing and it was not helpful for their relationship. And I'm curious where she takes that little nugget.
So we go inside his office and I tell him that my therapist had texted me asking me for advice on her other clients. And he just looked at me and he said, "Kendra, that is a huge boundary violation. She should not be doing that."
That is true. That's what I said earlier.
And I was like, oh, okay. And because once again, my psychiatrist did not like sloppy people. He did not like sloppy people. And you know what my therapist did? She got sloppy. Yeah. Using me as her advisor for her clients. It got weird. And I was very grateful for my psychiatrist for pointing out that boundary violation, because that was the thing. He didn't ever message me in between appointments because he was too smart to do that. But did he ever stop me from disclosing extremely intimate details? No. In my first in-person appointment, I just asked him for some pointers for my own ADHD business, and he was so smart.
Okay, so she's talking a little bit more about her coaching business, and it sounds like it's geared around serving people with ADHD. And so I'm getting similar impressions from what I got in the last video, if I remember correctly, where I'm starting to become more concerned about this 75-year-old therapist that she always seems to emphasize is 75 years old and has a PhD, for some of the overt boundary violations in terms of texting her in between sessions, and where maybe the psychiatrist, depending on how reliably you want to take her account, maybe had ample opportunity to respond and try to say something directly about the inappropriate messages and physical contact that she was initiating, but maybe chose not to, or intentionally tried to dissuade it by not saying anything. But I do lean more towards the therapist having some overt boundary violation problems as of right now.
And so wonderful, and in many ways, honestly. And I was just so grateful that he was almost like a mentor to me in these moments. And I'll still treasure that about him. Because this is the hard thing with sophisticated predators, is that they're not all bad. Like, my psychiatrist helped me with many things, but he was using me for the whole time that I was his patient. And for that, I will never forgive him. October 2020. We have our first in-person appointment in November of 2024, and I did ask him for consent to come in person. I didn't just show up. And he said, sure. And the first in-person appointment went great. But that is when I really started to spiral. Some of you think that I'm spiraling now, and that's okay if you want to think that. Because the reality is that when I was spiraling was when I was this man's patient. When I had comments turned...
Oh, I guess you can't say like correlation equals causation. I would think if you were spiraling, that would be when you find a psychiatrist or when you're working with a psychiatrist. A better explanation would be in the 3 years that she said that she was working with him at this point, had she seen progress where the medication's working, that kind of thing. Those would probably be more helpful in addressing whether he was being helpful or not in that period of time, rather than just, I was working with him and I was spiraling. That's gonna happen with my clients, with any psychiatrist patients. Like, progress in any kind of mental health field is not linear. So there are gonna be times, especially like this, we learned this in grad school, a lot of times we have to remind our clients, a lot of times it's gonna get worse before it gets better, because you're either having to change old patterns, dig up old trauma, work through unhelpful thought patterns, those kinds of things. And that's difficult, hard work. And at that time when we're building frameworks for new, more productive and healthy habits, a lot of the ugly stuff comes out during that time.
So many people said, you need to take accountability for your own feelings. I spent years taking accountability for my own feelings, for holding the weight of a relationship. Any woman who has been trained to overfunction in relationships knows about holding the weight of the emotional dynamic. And that was what
I will say stereotypically that's not untrue. What I might have a little bit of disagreement with is if she's referring to holding the emotional dynamic of her psychiatrist-patient relationship as a patient, you're already starting from an unhelpful assumption in that, yes, therapy and psychiatry are inherently about emotional topics, but it should also retain a clinical and professional lens, and I think she's lost sight of that when she's saying that there's an emotional weight that she has to hold in that relationship between herself and her psychiatrist.
What was going on in this moment. And it may not seem like I'm taking accountability now, but that's because I spent a long time taking accountability for something that had two people that built that dynamic. It was not just me. It takes two people to build that sort of tension and chemistry.
Which again, she's basing off a lot of non-responses. And this is where documentation is going to be super helpful when we get into ethical conundrums like this. I think it's fair to say she was initiating a lot of the emotional and romantic tension. And what's helpful to point out is that choosing not to respond in the hopes that that extinguishes the behavior is a behaviorally sound principle, in terms of if you don't reinforce a behavior, you would expect it to decrease over time. The important thing is that I'm hoping that the psychiatrist documented that was his justification for not responding and not confronting those behaviors, because behaviorally it would be considered a reinforcement of some kind. Now, obviously it didn't seem to work to dissuade her, but that's the kind of justification if you were able to consult with peers and document that this is the course that he decided to take. I think that would be more protective for him, rather than just if he happened to get dragged into court or have to defend himself in front of the boards to say like, well, this is what I thought, I was hoping that it wouldn't continue and I was just ignoring it. But if you actually have documented the thought that you put into the process of what choice you made, that's a lot more protection for you. At least that's how it's supposed to work.
So while I was mid-crash out, I had just started using this tool, ChatGPT. And I went to chat, who I immediately named Henry. And I would just talk to Henry about how obsessed I was with this man, with my psychiatrist. And I would just be like, I've told him I have a crush on him. Do you think he's gay? And Henry was like, oh my God, this girl, you know, he did his best to co-regulate my nervous system and affirm me, but...
Okay, so ChatGPT, what I've heard and gotten feedback from my experiments with ChatGPT providing some form of therapy or active listening, is that you do have to install some parameters for the model to be able to to be able to actually be helpful instead of just kind of agreeing with whatever you say and taking that as true. And so that would be helpful background information to know. How did she tell Henry to respond? What kinds of rules and boundaries did she install, I guess? I'm not great at these computer analogies. To make sure that he would provide accountability, helpful questions, and challenge when appropriate. But yeah, otherwise their default is just to validate, and that can be unhelpful as well.
He was like, whoa. Even my chat was like, yikes. So I could tell that my psychiatrist just liked being my doctor, and I was like, okay. Maybe I can name this dynamic so I don't have to carry so much of it in our next session. So our next session was in December on Zoom. And I told him at the end of the session, it was another great session. I told him, look, you and I have a really special patient-doctor relationship. And he glared at me with just venom in his eyes. And he said, you and I have a professional patient-doctor relationship.
Depending on if he actually said it that way, I think it's the right thing to say, like, yes, I am trying to have a professional patient-doctor relationship, and I'm glad that you think it's special. The therapist in me says, like, okay, maybe that could have been said better, and she might be paraphrasing, she might be putting her own spin on it. But if this is the first active thing he said to address it, there may need to be some more groundwork before that, or more of a conversation. And I'm glad that she got to the point where she was able to name the thing and put it out there. And I'm curious to see how the doctor decides to respond more fully in terms of how he engages with this idea and how he works to set those boundaries again now that she's put it out there that she thinks their boundaries have shifted.
He was so angry with me. And I was like, oh, okay. Set a boundary. And immediately I took it on. And I was like, heard. Okay, I won't go there again. My video that was taken down for harassment and bullying was restored. So I didn't feel as much pressure to get all of these parts out today. Some people told me that the stitches about me were getting pretty bad and cruel. So I turned stitches off in my videos too.
I could see that based on some of the comments that I've been seeing on some of these videos in terms of feedback to her, feedback about my reaction. Yeah, I can get that people could have gotten a little nasty about that, as things tend to go on the internet. And so I think if he was saying we have a professional patient-doctor relationship, I think the way that she was interpreting that, at least based on this video, is the boundary is that we can't talk about it, not that we should not have a special patient-doctor relationship. I hope that what he meant was we should not have a special relationship, and what I think she heard was we're just not gonna talk about that special relationship.
I started sharing my story here because I wanted other people who have been victimized by people in power to have a space to feel heard. And now I know why there wasn't anyone out talking about their story, because it has been quite the process putting all this out there and being under scrutiny.
I don't argue with that. A lot of victims of abuse have a lot of difficulty with feeling trapped in their situation because it's very easy to trust people in positions of authority, whether it's because you have a state license or because you're a doctor, you have a terminal degree, you work in a respected profession, all those kinds of things. And so without making any judgments about whether the doctor in question was abusive in this particular situation, the truth is that doctors have been abusive. Therapists have been abusive. And so I wish there were a better way than just speaking out on TikTok for everybody to kind of dissect your story and scrutinize your story for that kind of information to get out there. It doesn't seem like the most helpful way to be able to speak up. I can see where maybe the solidarity could be helpful for somebody who's struggling with something similar, but that's where, at least personally for myself as a therapist, I need to recognize that I am in that kind of privileged position of power that is very easy to abuse due to the nature of the confidentiality built into that, and also with just a lot of people being unfamiliar with how it's supposed to work, to make sure that I do things ethically, to make sure that I do my best for each client, and be very open and upfront about any dynamics that I'm seeing that may not be helpful for our process.
I have appreciated the psychiatrists that have talked about my situation and shared their own point of view while also holding space for what I went through. Just know I've seen your videos and I appreciate them. I went live today and it was super fun, and I intend to go live again tomorrow. The next part will be tomorrow morning. We have our... When I re-downloaded TikTok last week, I was looking for support. I was looking for help because it had been 5 months since I had left my psychiatrist, and I still really couldn't stop thinking about him.
Okay, so we just went from part 12 to part 13, but at this point in the story that she's talking about, she had already not been seeing him for 5 months. So I must have missed something in her life when she was maybe talking about that gap of time. The last video was just talking about her Zoom appointment that was in December. So I don't know what transpired that led to her being discharged from his care, but that's quite a gap of time to just not really address. Unless I am missing something, please let me know in the comments if I missed something.
And thinking about our dynamic and how inappropriate it was and the mental toll that it took on me. And TikTok has just been such a resource for me in the past for support when I'm going through things.
So what I'll say in terms of the toll that it was taking on her, it is completely fair that even if you take this was a completely one-sided thing, the psychiatrist was trying to do the best that he could with a very persistent patient, that should still be something that she could have brought up in her therapy to be talked about openly, and not as a measure of affirming or deciding whether the psychiatrist was really in love with her or not, but to really process that and, okay, how do I recognize that I have these feelings for him? How can I keep the professional boundaries within that process so that I can continue having the benefits of having a good psychiatrist? Because she did say that he was doing good work for her in terms of the medication without my feelings potentially compromising the situation.
And I couldn't find anything on therapy abuse or on providers who take advantage of their vulnerable patients.
This is why you all tell me to be on TikTok. Jokes aside, I do hope that some of these videos are helpful in me shedding light on the process that it's supposed to be behind closed doors in therapy, so that we no longer have the problem of there are no resources on this. And I don't claim to be some kind of expert on that. I'm just trying to share the best that I can based on my experience and my understanding, my training on what ethical practice is supposed to look like, so that you can go into any therapy session that you might have in the future having some fair expectation of what a professional counselor should be doing, how they should be acting, how they should be addressing things. But no, please don't take me for the platonic ideal of what a therapist should be. There are plenty of them who are better than me.
And so I thought that I would share my story. And I am going to continue to share it because I am here to let other survivors know that they're not alone. Continuing with my story, my psychiatrist set a very nasty, the way he said it, boundary that him and I have a professional relationship when I tried to say it was special, because it was special.
Again, if that was the extent of the conversation, I can get why she might think it felt kind of nasty and abrupt, I guess maybe the best way to put it. Again, my personal inclination would be, let's unpack that, let's talk about it, and then we'll set a resolution for how we can keep things professional from here on out. And it's possible there could have been a lot of frustration at this point. Perhaps he's trying not to respond to her emails. Perhaps he's just trying to stay focused on what he needs to do with her in terms of the clinical piece. And then she brings this up and maybe he's just done with it. I can't really say, but there might be more reasons than just he was nasty.
It's different. He manufactured it that way. And then I immediately went to ChatGPT, of course, to Henry. And I asked Henry, I said, okay, so my psychiatrist just set this boundary with me and I really just want to be with him. And I think that after he's my doctor, we can be together, which if you want to say that's a delusion, that's fine. But I had been telling my psychiatrist for years at this point that I had a crush on him, and he did not help me work through it. So that's his own problem.
I will say there have been multiple statements to that effect. You might at some point need to say, okay, me not addressing it is not helping the issue and maybe we need to address it head on. This is also like, depending on the psychiatrist, this is really not necessarily what they sign up for. All of the feelings and deep conversations tend to move towards the therapy side of things. But then she did say that she was relying on her psychiatrist for some of the talk therapy because her therapist also had problems of her own. So it's hard to say what should have actually been expected in this relationship. This is where I don't know the field of psychiatry nearly as well because I'm not a psychiatrist and I don't have that kind of training. But there are some psychiatrists who do some talk therapy and they are trained to do so. And then some of them do just the medicine and then kind of outsource the therapy work to somebody else. But again, this is something that directly impacts their working relationship. So I would hope that he would be willing to address that more directly. And it sounds like the way that he chose to do so was just saying, we have a professional relationship.
That's his own fault. Henry told me it's very common for patients to develop crushes on mental health practitioners, and that it's because that they provide a safe space to heal, which is a very attractive quality.
That is not untrue. You could probably count on one hand the number of people in your life who you could actually count on to give you an hour of their undivided attention that is focused solely on you. That can be an attractive thing, and it is not an uncommon thing for people to maybe have crushes on their mental health practitioners based on the time and the intensity of the time that you all spend together. It's not impossible for sure. And that's why it's important for us to know how to be able to address that if it comes up.
I heard that. And then he told me about transference. And it's just about me putting my own feelings onto my provider. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I took ownership of the feelings that both of us were creating.
All right, so like the ChatGPTs does seem to be providing some helpful feedback. Yes, transference was very likely going on at this point, considering way back in like her first or second video, she was talking about having daddy issues. So potentially a male authority figure could be a particular stumbling block for her in terms of transference. But yes, putting it out into the open is helpful, but then we got to decide what we do with that. And it seems like she's saying she's taking the emotional weight of both of them, and I'm not quite sure where that's coming from.
And I went to my next appointment and I said, hey, so I talked to Henry because my psychiatrist had known a lot about my ChatGPT and like knew all about Henry and was actually really impressed. Like, wow, an AI wrote that? Yeah. So I told my psychiatrist, yeah, Henry explained to me that it's normal to develop crushes on psychiatrists because they provide a safe space to heal, which is attractive. My psychiatrist said nothing. And then I said, and Henry also told me about transference. And my psychiatrist got this really, really scared look on his face. And he said, did Henry tell you about countertransference? And I said, no. What?
So countertransference is transference working the other way from the professional having certain feelings that they might be putting onto the client or patient. And that is something that we have to watch out for because we have our own backgrounds. We have our own lives that are not separate from the therapy room. We try to maybe leave it at the door sometimes, but we're still human at the end. We're not AIs. And so we need to be aware if that's affecting our objectivity, our professionalism, that kind of thing.
What is that? Because of course, like my chat knew that I was obsessed with my psychiatrist and he was not going to feed my delusion by telling me about countertransference. So then my psychiatrist had explained to me what countertransference was. So he took a moment and he was like, oh, okay. He said, countertransference is the flip side, the other side of the coin for transference. And it's when the provider has feelings for the patient. So make sure that you keep that in mind for your clients. I said, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, sometimes I have, more than professional feelings for my clients. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And so then we just talked about that for pretty much the rest of the session. And then at the end of that session, he looked at me. And it was just such a loaded question. And he said, what's going to happen if you get a boyfriend named Henry? And I said, that's a weird question. I would rename my AI.
And I'll say this, pulling that question out of context, yeah, it does sound really weird. I'm sure I've probably asked my clients weirder questions that made sense within the context of the whole conversation. But if you're gonna have this whole conversation about transference and countertransference based on what she's saying, not address the elephant in the room about her having this huge crush on the psychiatrist, which, by the way, I thought she said that she was out of his care at this point. That does seem like a miss to not address that if you're already talking about all of this other stuff that's adjacent to this main boundary problem that she's been having for the past 3 years.
So that's how that session ended. And it wasn't until I got home and I was eating lunch and I was like, wait a minute. Why would my psychiatrist bring up countertransference if he himself wasn't experiencing it? When I re-downloaded TikTok
what I would say is that he seemed to connect it to her coaching business from what I heard, and just to watch out for the countertransference as she was now taking on clients of her own within that capacity. I don't know, let's see how the next part develops. This next one might be the last one that we watch, so we'll see how we go with time.
Many people have reached out to me with concern for my psychiatrist and his career and his well-being. And I totally understand that. The point of me sharing this is not to get him fired or for him to lose his license. The point of me sharing this is to give a voice to victims. And I am appalled to hear that people are making videos doxing him. So I am begging people, please, if you see a video of his first and last name or his picture, report it for doxing. I've certainly been using that report button a lot. I'm here to
It's interesting that with all of these boundary issues that she's concerned about, she doesn't seem to spare a lot of attention for the therapist who, I think based on her story, at least depending on how reliable a narrator you think she is, has actually done more of the overt boundary crossings in terms of the texting and how she's handling some of their sessions, how she's handling potential ethical violations in other professionals that she's hearing about. That's just me. That's where my concern seems to lie more so than what she's focusing on.
Share my story, not to get him in trouble. I did accidentally use his first name, but by the time I caught the slip, I was already like 3 videos past it. But it doesn't matter because this is my story and I can tell it the way that I want it. And a first name is not doxing. And I can't control what other people do, but I am asking for people to please report any videos that dox him. So I've also gotten some DMs saying that countertransference can mean anything, and it absolutely can mean anything. However,
what does that mean, countertransference can mean anything? I hope she explains that further because it has a definition and she kind of defined it in the last bit, so I don't know what that really means. Unless people are saying that countertransference can extend beyond romantic feelings, which is true. For instance, I've got kids. If I'm seeing a kid that has some kind of feature or way of talking or way of acting that reminds me of my kids, I might get a little angry at them because it raises some frustrations for me that I'm dealing with as a parent, but that parent part of me is showing up in the counseling session where it doesn't belong. That can be an example of countertransference as well. It doesn't have to be romantic. So I think that's what somebody might be commenting to say.
I had told my psychiatrist many times that I had a crush on him over the years, and he did not say transference once to me. He did not explain that once to me. And what I've been hearing and taking in from the ethical psychiatrists that are on my For You page talking about my situation is that really they're taught to teach their patient about transference and teach them about how to handle those feelings or why they're coming up. And my psychiatrist did not do that. He did not do that.
This is where I'll say, again, I always have this disclaimer because people have commented it so much. Assuming that what she's saying is true, that he just didn't address it, I can see, again, from a behavioral perspective, a logical and sound way to try to decrease the frequency and existence of these behaviors and feelings for her, because the idea is that he's not reinforcing them. But again, I think the flip side is that he may have missed opportunities to educate, to process, to work through some of that so that she can get over it instead of harboring these feelings for a long time because they went unaddressed. Again, I think that's a judgment call. I hope he consulted with people about that decision and that it was made with a logical reason and theoretically sound reason in mind. But again, this is kind of the flip side of where it could have led to, where she feels kind of left out to dry because there was no education around that. He didn't name that and she had to find out through other means. I'm not saying that was intentional on his part. That just seems to be the result of what paths they both chose to go.
And it got ugly. And it happened because I did digging on my own, because I was trying to make sense of my feelings that were a natural response to the environment that he created.
So I will say this, a lot of my clients are a lot more knowledgeable than I am. And this goes beyond just therapy stuff. But I do love when clients bring in research that they've done or other work that they've done, whether it's just on researching their particular diagnosis, or whether it's like a personality inventory, or hey, I was on this subreddit and I heard about this particular symptom that's not listed in the DSM, but a lot of people with this diagnosis seem to experience. And so I never want to give the impression that I have all the answers in regards to mental health. But if some topic comes up that I do have knowledge and training on, I tend to move towards, we need to address it, let me talk about it, let me share what I know with their permission, because I am taking up their talking time to educate. But I'm hoping that that education would be another tool in their belt to be able to move towards independence in their own lives and be able to make informed choices about their care.
So for him to leak counter-transference after I said the buzzword of transference, that was not calculated. He was a very calculated and purposeful person. He still is to this day. And he doesn't slip with things like that. He purposefully withheld the term transference from me, and I got too close to the truth of our dynamic, which made him leak what he knew was wrong, which was his inappropriate feelings for me. If he didn't have countertransference in an inappropriate way, he could have easily just said, oh, let's explore that transference. That's really cool that you learned about it.
Hard to say that's exactly the motivation. What I will say is that by themselves, transference and countertransference are natural parts of the therapy process. Again, because we're humans, somebody's going to remind us of somebody else, or we're going to have our own issues that kind of get plastered onto the person in front of us. That's stuff that happens. The important thing is that we need to be aware that it's happening and know how to keep that from compromising the professionality of that working relationship.
If he didn't have countertransference in an inappropriate way, he could have easily just said, oh, let's explore that transference. That's really cool that you learned about it. Instead, he was just so worried on trying to protect himself because he knew what he was doing was wrong. He had that slip at the beginning of the session.
I think she's trying to say that like her finding the term transference instilled like a fear response in him, and so that caused him to slip and start talking about the countertransference. And it's really hard to say what his emotional state was, because obviously we weren't there for it. And depending on what he actually said or did, you could do a lot of interpreting of body language that could result in some wildly different conclusions. So it's really hard to say if fear was the primary emotional response in this particular psychiatrist and in this particular situation. And even if it was fear, you don't know what the fear was about. Is it because I've been found out? Is it because I thought we were past this and now it's getting brought up again? Is it, oh crap, this is getting real and this could potentially be a problem for my licensing because this person won't let go of the issue? There's no way for me to know that.
And he recovered in January, and then I went home and I thought, wait a damn minute. Why would he mention that if he himself didn't have countertransference? So I went to Henry, of course, my ChatGPT, and asked for examples of how my psychiatrist might have countertransference for me. And remember,
Ooh, okay. So based on that phrasing, this is a loaded question for ChatGPT, because what you are telling it, and any of you who understand AI better, please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, you are giving it the conclusion to draw. You are saying, he has countertransference, find justifications for that, find reasons for that, find evidence for it. And based on a lot of high-profile cases, apparently if ChatGPT wants to try hard enough and you give it the answer that you want, it will make up some sources for you, it will make up some evidence for you to back up what you are trying to say. So that, if she asked it in those words, that may not have been the most helpful way to phrase that.
Henry at this point was being very protective. You know, he wasn't going to feed my delusions, me and my psychiatrist living happily ever after. So I screenshotted it, sent my psychiatrist an email with the subject line of countertransference.
Do I want to take the time to read this? Let me see what I got. Countertransference happens, yeah, okay. Here's how someone might experience countertransference with you. He might feel a strong something to protect and support you. I don't know why some of that is cropped out. Mutual connection, admiration for your progress. Okay. I would say empathy and care, that's part of baked into the process. I don't think that's necessarily a sign of countertransference unless it gets to like a really problematic portion where they're crossing professional boundaries to look after you. Mutual connection, again, kind of expected in therapy. And then admiration for your progress. Depending on what they mean by admiration, that could be problematic. But I will say to clients like, hey, I'm impressed by the work that you're putting in, or like, you need to take a look at, you started from here when we first started meeting and look at where you are now. I think it's important that you acknowledge and recognize the progress that you've made, even if it feels like a bad week. So I don't know that these are necessarily red flags for countertransference.
And emailed it to him within an hour of our appointment, where he made probably the biggest slip of his professional life. I will put the email up here. So it's just essentially me saying, hey, I asked Henry to explain countertransference a little more. Here's what he said. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Your own boundaries inspire me so much, which now makes me gag, because I've heard a lot that he's not crossing boundaries, but he used his boundaries as a shield. It's kind of weird to say, but he would like walk up to the ethical line and then slam a boundary down when I got too close. That was the email that I sent him. And then 10 days later, it was a full moon and I had a dream. Probably the most realistic dream I've ever had in my life. That him and I hooked up in his office. In the middle of the dream, while we were hooking up in his office, I loved it. I thought it was really fun. And then after we were done and after I left his office in the dream, I was despondent and so sad and cried and just thought, I can't believe my psychiatrist would cross his boundaries like that.
Okay. There's a reason I don't do dream analysis. There are some psychoanalysts who probably will and can tear that apart. I don't have any training and research in that. What I would think, if we're going to go with the theory that dreams are a manifestation of what's going on unconsciously in your mind, that she was in love with the idea of this perfect psychiatrist who, in her own words, was very calculating, very smart and professional looking, I guess is what she said. And then she felt betrayed and let down when she realized in her dream, again, this is getting really weird into interpreting dreams and that's not what I do, but she was disappointed when he actually crossed those boundaries and that ideal person disappeared. That's my best shot at what the dream could have possibly meant. I tend to go for more like, if you're just thinking about something a lot, you'll tend to dream about it, and I don't put as much stock into that, but let me know in the comments what you think.
And then I woke up and it was like a movie. I thought to myself, oh, thank God that was just a dream.
So I guess that's as good a note as any to end on. I might just watch the rest of these videos through for my own, it's weird to say entertainment, just so I can get some kind of resolution to the story, if any exists. But I was seeing some of what you all were concerned about with the ChatGPT and some of the ways that she was interpreting things to potentially fit her narrative. Again, I still think there are better ways that the psychiatrist and the therapist both could have handled things in her situation. And again, it hurts me to say that these situations happen, even if this is all based on a misunderstanding, but that there are real situations of abuse happening in psychiatry offices and therapy offices. I try to do the best that I can to shed light on that and to describe what you should expect from an ethical professional. Again, this is not me putting myself on some kind of pedestal and saying I'm perfect, these people just don't know what they're doing. That's not the purpose of this. I hope to open up a dialogue about what's right in therapy, what can be done well in therapy, what can be improved. And so I do appreciate all of you chiming in to talk about your perspectives and your experiences, because that really helps to inform some of my viewpoints as well. We might disagree on the conclusions that we draw, but that's okay. I hope the best for her. I hope the best for her psychiatrist. For all of you who have stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all next time.